and wanted to make sure that it was going straight up, they didn't have the little bubble levels like my dad had. They would just take a string and put a weight on it, and gravity is going to pull it straight down. It's going to make a straight up and down line, and so a plumb line is what you use to measure whether what you built is straight and will stand the test of time. I would offer to give this yo-yo to somebody out there, but I actually tried to use this yo-yo. You don't want it. It will not work as an actual yo-yo. So let's go back into what Amos was saying. When God says, I am putting a plumb line in the middle of Israel, what he's saying is, I am coming to measure whether what my people have built themselves into is something that will stand the test of time, or whether they've gone crooked and built on that crookedness until you get something that's just going to fall apart. God said to Amos, I know that the people of my kingdom, Israel, are wanting me to pay more attention to them and to their needs, so that's what I am doing now. And here's the bad news. I can tell you exactly what they need from my plumb line. They need to be torn down and rebuilt from the foundations up. Once I passed over their ancestors in Egypt and spared them when the angel of death roamed from house to house in the 10th plague. But I'm done passing over. This wall needs to be torn down and rebuilt from the bottom up. That's hard words to hear. And that's probably not what Israel had in mind when they had said that they wanted God to pay more attention to them. But the fact is, they had become proud. They had forgotten to love God and love their neighbors, and especially their underprivileged and vulnerable neighbors who needed their love and care the most. They had built their society into a crooked wall, and that kind of wall is not worthy to be called the people of God. The time had come to tear down that wall and to start new from the bottom up, and that's exactly what happened. That part of Israel that Amos came from, which is the northern kingdom of Israel, there's not a geography test at the end, but just it helps for me to visualize. That northern part of Israel was invaded by the Assyrians, who came in and utterly destroyed their society. Other people from other places were brought in by the Assyrians to live in the land that had belonged to the Israelites. And over time, those northern Israelites lost their identity. They came to be known not by the name of Israel, but after the name of their old capital in the northern kingdom, which was called Samaria. Yes, it was those Israelites who became the Samaritans. The Israelites from the southern kingdom of Judah became the Jews. But the Samaritans will come into our story again today. Changing gears for just a moment, I was on a retreat one time at Subiaco Abbey. I met a guy there who was scandalized by the idea that Jesus, as a child, had to learn his alphabet. Because if Jesus is the Son of God, then doesn't Jesus get born knowing the alphabet? That was what he thought. He thought Jesus must have known everything in the universe from the time that he was a tiny baby. Well, the Scripture doesn't actually say that. The Scripture does not tell us that Jesus came into the world like a computer with a software bundle already included with your Microsoft Outlook Express that's there if you don't take it off. But of course, Jesus did have to grow. Jesus did have to learn. Jesus is born in the manger and does not enter conversation at that time. When it came time for Joseph to move the family up to Egypt for a few years, or down to Egypt for a few years, because Herod was after the babies, why would the angel have come to Joseph in a dream? Why would not baby Jesus have sat up in his crib, spit out the pacifier, and said, "Come on, Papa Bear, I want to see me some pyramids"? The fact is that we learn things a little at a time. Things become clear to us over time, and it's always been that way. You may know that when God came to Abraham and called him to leave his country and his kindred and his father's house and to go wherever God would send him, that Abraham was leaving behind his polytheistic ways, the worshiping many gods, the ways of his ancestors. But what you may not know is that even though Abraham worshipped only one God instead of many gods, he had not yet figured out that there was only one God in the universe. That's strange to hear, because we know there only is one God. Abraham didn't realize it at first. For a long time, in fact, the Israelites figured that there were probably many gods out there, but there was only one God for Israel to worship, the God who had created the universe. And that God was the chief of all and the creator of all. Do you find that hard to believe? I can prove it. It's a weird thing to wrap your mind around, but listen to what Psalm 82 says. God has taken his place in the divine council. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. How long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? Give justice to the weak and the orphan. Maintain the right of the lowly and the destitute. Rescue the weak and the needy. Deliver them from the hand of the wicked. They have neither knowledge nor understanding. They walk around in darkness, and all the foundations of the earth are shaken. I say, you are gods, children of the Most High, all of you. Nevertheless, you shall die like mortals and fall like any prince. Rise up, O God, and judge the earth, for all the nations belong to you. Notice that when the psalmist here is describing his vision of God, he's imagining a meeting of the big God with all of the little lesser gods. Later in time, Scripture will begin to refer to these as angels instead of as gods, because they're a different type of thing. But that realization only came through time. Through time, they came to see that only one God was really God, and what the rest of the world called gods were actually lesser servants of the one true God. But the Jews really did not understand it this way until they were captives in Babylon, long after King David and King Solomon and the prophet Elijah. So the people acknowledged the existence of many gods and worshipped many gods in the oldest days. But then when Abraham came, they still figured there were other gods out there maybe, but the only one God was for them, the God of Israel, the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And then in time they came to realize that in fact there is only one true God, which is the one that they worshipped. It took time for all of that to become clear. Here's another example of learning over time. When Moses was leading the people of Israel in the wilderness, they carried with them the Ark of the Covenant, having borrowed it from the set of Indiana Jones. Who here has seen Indiana Jones, the first Indiana Jones movie? Okay, you know the box at the end that the Nazis open up and their faces melt off? This is what I'm talking about. This very box. Just a wooden box made of acacia wood, covered in a thin layer of gold, with a lid on it, containing a carving of two angels, and that lid was what they called the mercy seat. And they called it that because God had promised to be present to them in a special way whenever they came to worship there. In a very similar way that God is specially present to us when we come before the altar table in communion. But the people thought that the lid was the only place God was. God said, I'll be present to you in a special way here, and they thought, this is God's chair, where God sits, and God doesn't sit anywhere else. That's pretty common in the ancient world. People thought of God as doing things like that. And that was what they figured. And so eventually, when King Solomon came around, he built a temple in Jerusalem specifically for the purpose of holding that box, since the people thought that God lived on the lid. And eventually they got comfortable with the idea that God was ruler over all the territory of the tribes of Israel from that seat. But then the unthinkable happened. Bigger than 9/11 for these guys. After the Samaritans had been smashed, as we mentioned earlier, the Jews were left in Judah. But then they too were smashed by the Babylonians, and they were carried off. Their leadership was all carried off to the land of Babylon. And guess what else was smashed? The temple that held the Ark of the Covenant. And the Ark of the Covenant was never seen again. So all these Jews in Babylon felt totally helpless and alone because their lid was gone. And that was what they thought God's chair was. And that is exactly when the prophet Ezekiel had his vision of the chariot of God flying over the distant sands of Babylon. This is a wheels within wheels prophecy that the National Enquirer always insists is about UFOs. It is not about UFOs. It is the chariot of God. This is God's way of saying to the people of Israel, to Ezekiel and all the Jews, Don't worry. You thought I lived on a